Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week is one of the most recognisable names in contemporary board game design and publishing. On top of designing hits like Viticulture and Scythe, he was the first to really crack Kickstarter before stepping away. Since then, he's continued to have a great success with titles like Between Two Castles and Mad King Ludwig and 2019's Kennerspiel des Jahres winner Wingspan. My guest this week is Jamey Stegmaier. Jamey, welcome to the cabin.
Welcome to the cabin. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So to begin then, how difficult was it for you to pick the 5 games that you're going to take away with you?
It was pretty difficult. I've done a 10-game pick in the past, and that was difficult. So to get that even down to 5 was difficult. But I like the theme of your podcast because it leads to some interesting choices that are a little different than if the question of like, which 10 games of your collection would you just keep? It's a little different if we're talking about a post-apocalyptic scenario.
Yeah, so, I mean, people have been saying that the difference with this is it's not necessarily your favourite games, because there are different criteria if you want to spend eternity with a set of games. So, what was your criteria? Is it purely pragmatic? Was there any sentiment there? Are you attached to games as objects?
I am not, I'm not, a lot of gamers are collectors, and to a certain extent I get satisfaction from looking at my collection of games, but I am also the type of person where I only really want games on my shelf if I'm actively playing them. So every year I do a purge. If I haven't played a game in a year, I get rid of it. I give it to someone who wants to play it. And so in that way, I'm able to let go of games if I don't think I'm going to play them.
I mean, it's clear with your publishing that you see games as more than just a collection of mechanics. How important for you when it comes to games, how important is the sort of artifact element, the tactility, the way they look, the way they feel, that sort of stuff?
Oh, that's a huge part of the experience for me. And actually, I'm not even sure if the games that I picked today that we'll discuss fall into that category all that well. A few of them do, but a few of them don't. But yeah, that's a huge part of what draws me to the tabletop. Part of it's the social aspect, part of it's the creative cleverness, problem-solving aspect, but a huge part of it is that tactile, aesthetic aspect of games that I really love.
And I mean, to what degree are you one of these people, if you go to a game night and you walk past a table and you see something that's arresting on the table, are you the kind of person that stops and says, ooh, what's this? And looks at it and your brain starts to tick over about your own sort of projects?
Oh yeah, I do that all the time. I would say most often I do it when I'm watching like video reviews or reading on Instagram too, actually. Anywhere where there's a visual, I am just kind of fascinated by the way components fit together, the way they look. And that often ends up giving me ideas. 2 of my games have actually originated because of art or components that I saw and thought, oh, I want to make a game that has that type of thing in it.
And sort of, do you see games as pieces to show off? You listen to some podcasts and people talk about liking to have them on the shelf because of the way they look. And you said you're not a collector and you do a purge, but, do you have certain games that you look at and you think, wow, this is something that is really arresting, is really interesting above just the gameplay?
Can you give me an example?
I'm trying to think of games that look really super interesting. Someone bought the other week, one of my friends bought, there's this game by oh God, I can't remember. They're an English publisher, and it was published about 5 years ago. And it was this game, and it had ceramic goblins in it that were really big ceramic goblins. And it was the big arresting thing about the game was that you had these pieces that were sort of transcending just what a game piece can be.
I can remember one where I first had that experience, and it was with an older version of Kemet. Have you played Kemet? Yeah. So I don't know if the current versions have this, but the early versions of it had these. They still have the miniatures, but the miniatures for the different, like the scorpion and the war elephant that you can get during the game, they were. I'm pretty sure they were resin, so they had a nice weight to them, and they were inked. And they were the perfect, and I don't think inked miniatures always work, but they really worked well in this version. And they were the right color too. They were this old school Egyptian tan beige color. I just love getting those on the table. So that was definitely one of the earliest examples I can think of that really drew me in.
And for me, I find a real difficulty sort of playing prototypes in the... I like to rail against this idea that everything should be full of plastic, and yet when it comes down to it, I like to see things that are visually interesting. I mean, is it a torture for you to play prototypes when you're someone who clearly likes the tactile and artistic aspect of things?
I'm so used to it that I wouldn't say that's the case. I did recently talk about this in terms of Tapestry, my newest game, and that I intentionally made the components for the prototype really as plain as possible for as long as possible, because I was constantly asking the question, does this thematically feel like a Civilization game? And so I didn't want to rely on art to capture that feeling. I knew that when we put the art on it, it would bias me and make me and other playtesters feel like it was a Civ game because it looked like one, but I wanted it mechanically to feel like one. So that was kind of, I was perfectly okay with it there because it was very intentional that I did not want to have pretty components as I was playtesting it.
And do you think that some people use components to cover up deficiencies in the game itself, or is that a really expensive way to cover up a dodgy game?
It has, I'm sure it's happened at some point when someone, but I bet it's pretty rare. I think for the most part, publishers and designers, especially in the tabletop, they want beautiful things. I want beautiful things. And so I think oftentimes the decision is more about budget. Like, do we have the budget to add something extra? Do we have the budget based on the target MSRP that requires us to maybe cut something that we'd like to include? So I think it often more comes down to that.
And how do you think you'd fare in a post-apocalyptic world? How long do you think you'd survive? Can you cut down trees? Can you build a shelter?
Me, I would. So I love the TV show Survivor, which I know is not post-apocalyptic, but it's a few people end up on an island with limited resources. And as much as I love the show, I've said for years that I would do very poorly on it because I get migraine headaches if I don't eat and sleep on a regular basis. And so, even though I think I'd figure out some of those other things, I'm not particularly craftsy, but I could probably figure out the logistics of surviving. But I think the migraines would put a damper on it. It would make that pretty difficult. Oh, the one asset that I would have is that I do have 20/20 vision. So I think that's the one thing that I would offer to people if the world ended and people's glasses were broken or they didn't have their contact fluid anymore. I could still see things. What were you going to say there? I'm sorry.
And yeah, how do you think you'd cope with any potential loneliness? Are you a gregarious person, or are you someone who sort of seeks solitude?
I am very much an introvert, but through the tabletop world, I do seek social interactions in particular, and food. Those are my main two social elements. So in the cabin scenario, if I'm I think it would be okay, because in the cabin, I could be in the cabin when I want to be around people, and I could take a walk when I needed to be away from people.
Yeah, I think it's singular that you tend not to show up that often at conventions. Is this a symptom of your introvertedness? Is it just something that you don't enjoy?
It's a part of it is that there's a local convention that I go to called Geekway to the West that's here in St. Louis, and I really enjoy this convention. Partially, but despite my enjoyment, it's one of these conventions where you just go and play games for a few days, which is very much what I enjoy to do in general. But I do go home every night pretty exhausted from all the social interaction. So I've learned to not push myself, to go there for 8-9 hours and then have a few hours to just relax at night on my own. But conventions in general, it's not I haven't made it a big part of our marketing strategy. The expense is a lot. The time is a lot because I run my company with a lot of help, but I am our only full-time employee. So any 4 days I spend at a convention are 4 days that I'm not doing other things and that I need to catch up on later. So it's for various reasons, but the introversion does play into it a little bit.
So I want to go back to the beginning then. When did games enter your life? When did you become a gamer? And where are you from? Are you a St. Louis native?
I grew up, I'm not a St. Louis native. I grew up in Virginia, near Richmond, Virginia. Richmond's the capital of Virginia. It's a state, for those of you who aren't in the U.S., it's a state all the way over on the east coast of the U.S. I grew up there, and my parents exposed me to games from a pretty young age. I was pretty lucky, not just some of the American classics like Monopoly and Sorry, but also some pretty interesting, good games, in my opinion. Not that those games aren't good. I don't want to judge them, but games like Millbourne, Scotland Yard, Labyrinth. I was playing chess from a fairly young age, some card games. So I had a pretty good variety of games from a young age. And that evolved into Risk and Magic and some other games. So I've been lucky that I've been playing games and really designing games for most of my life.
And were your parents gamers too, or did they think that board gaming would be a sort of healthy pursuit for a growing boy?
I think, it was a combination. They weren't really gamers, no, but they loved family time. They loved doing things as a family, so games were a good way to do that. And I had a sister who was she's just a year younger than me, and then a brother who came along a few years later. So as the family grew, they were looking for more activities for us kids to do in our free time.
And so when did hobby games come into your purview? And, what was the first sort of hobby game that grabbed you and made you think, wow, this is something that's more than just something to do on a rainy Sunday afternoon?
Well, so it kind of happened as an adult. A few years after college, I found out that some friends were playing this game called Settlers of Catan. And I was really excited by it because I guess I had developed, through playing Magic, I played some Magic for a few years after college, and I had developed a perception of what modern gamers were. Nothing against like the stereotypical Magic player, but I didn't know that people who were already my friends were playing these types of games. So once I found that out, I was really excited about it, and that kind of opened the gateway to hobby games, and that was followed by Agricola. My eventual business partner was the friend who learned Agricola for the group, and we ended up playing that as our only game for quite some time. And so it's just really exciting for me to find people that I already knew that I related to and that I got along with were playing the types of games that I had always enjoyed.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when I do this show, I speak to people, and usually people fall into one of two categories. They either fall into Catan or D&D Red Box. And do you think the gaming world would be anything like it is today without Catan?
I don't. I think that's a great question. I don't think it would be. No, I mean, I'm sure eventually there would have been, hopefully Ticket to Ride would have still existed, or a few games of that ilk that reached close to the popularity of Catan. But I don't know, Catan has had it's brought so many people into the hobby. I don't play it much anymore, but I still admire it for what it is, and for like you alluded to, that it may have really opened the gates for making the hobby and the industry what it is today.
And so you said, you've been a designer for years and years and years too. Did you design games as a kid? Did you reiterate the games that you were playing with your parents?
Reiterate is the perfect word for it. I think you said that perfectly. Because from a young age, as soon as I was playing games, I had the creative bug to design games too. But many of my early designs were different versions of the games that I was playing. So I think my first game was called Medieval Quest, and it was kind of a Knights of the Round Table version of Monopoly. And then I had a game that was akin to Scotland Yard that I designed a few years later. So from those early games were very much iterations of existing games. Not reskins, but the similar mechanisms.
And did you ever think at any point, sort of, you say you went through college and you rediscovered games after college, Did you ever think at any point, this is going to be a viable career for me, or were you going to go into something more conventional?
Oh yeah, no, I never thought it would be anything close to a career. I thought I had two creative passions. One was writing fiction and one was designing games. And I thought maybe I might earn a little money on the side and have fun writing. But I did not think that games would be a part of that picture at all. So I had two completely unrelated to game jobs after college. One as a project manager at a medical textbook publishing company, another as a director of operations at a university facility. Both completely unrelated, and I never really thought it would be a part of my career at all. And now we're talking about, we're having this chat in 2019. I've been full-time at Stonemaier Games for almost 6 years now, so it has quite surprisingly become my career.
And what happened to the writing? Do you still write?
I write a lot for my company, but not fiction. I write a lot of blog posts and design diary type things. And I still love the world building aspect of writing that goes into designing my games. But no, I haven't written any sort of fiction other than for the games since 2012. So it's been a while. So I need to, eventually I'll rekindle that passion, but all of my creative energy is so focused on my company at this point.
So your first game then is an absolute bona fide classic that probably most of the people who are listening to this have at least come across at some point. And this is Magic. So what's your history with Magic? Were you there at the beginning, or was it something you picked up later?
So Magic I discovered, I think I was around 11 or 12. It was right when the revised set came out. So I was a little too late to get those super rare cards in alpha and beta, and there was a little set, I think, between that and revised. But I was into it during the revised stage as a teenager. And then once I hit high school, I kind of moved away from it. I was trying to be cool in high school, so I moved away from Magic for a little bit. And then I came back after college when I found that it was still going and that it was really robust and had evolved quite a bit in interesting ways.
And how good are you? Are you a good Magic player, or is it purely for fun?
It is mostly for fun. I went to a few tournaments in my early 20s, and I was not very good. But I really enjoyed deck building at that time. And then it was a few years later that I got into Magic Online and really discovered drafting and how much fun drafting was. I wish I had discovered that when I was younger. I had no idea that drafting was a thing, but I absolutely love the drafting aspect in Magic, and really in most games that involve some form of passing things from one player to the next. That's been what's kind of kept Magic alive for me to this day.
And so, when you look at Magic, Magic is probably, along with Catan, probably the biggest success story in sort of modern gaming. How much has it influenced you both as a publisher and a designer? As
a publisher, I'm just impressed. I'm just impressed by what they've managed to pull off with such consistency. As a designer, and maybe a publisher at most, maybe the art has the consistent quality of the art has inspired me in some ways. As a designer, I love playing every new Magic set at least once, because there's so many clever aspects of the design that go into each set. Like with a game that already has so many mechanisms, they still manage to keep it fresh and tie in mechanisms with the theme in every set. And so I love discovering the little things they do with the major mechanisms they add, and even like the little card cycles they add that are interesting. So in many ways that are conscious, and many ways I'm sure that are subconscious and subconscious, it's impacted me as a designer.
And is there anything that you can point to in any of your games that you've, if not lifted from Magic, but sort of been inspired by?
Well, the idea of card cycles definitely has. Where if I have a certain type of card, I might try to have it apply to all of the different resources in the game in a slightly different way. Most recently, with Tapestry, there was an older mechanism in Magic called Suspend, where you would, I'm not even sure if there was a cost maybe there was a small cost to suspend a card, and then every turn you would take a counter off that card, and then it would just appear into play when all the counters are gone, instead of paying a big cost, or even some of those cards didn't have any cost that you could just play them outright. And so there's a mechanism in Tapestry that's a little bit like that, where you're playing these tech cards, and you don't really have to do anything. The tech cards are going to get better on their own as your civilization advances, and that was inspired a bit by Suspend.
And so you said you sort of dallied in the tournament scene of Magic. Do you understand the tournament scene of games at all? Because, I mean, would you like to see something like there be a Scythe World Championship? I mean, maybe there is, or something like that, and see your games played competitively, or are you just not interested in that?
Early on in my company, I was intrigued by that possibility because I had been to a few Magic tournaments. I'd heard of tournaments for other games, and I had just seen the excitement around them. When you're in a room with 300 Magic players that are just really excited to be there and really excited to try out their decks, it's contagious. And so early on in my company, I ran a Euphoria tournament, my second game, Euphoria. And it was a lot of fun. People seemed to have a good time. There was a cash prize. And I walked away from it, excited by what had happened, but also feeling distinctly like it was not a match for my company in ways that I'm not even sure I can describe, but just the general feel of how I want people to feel when they walk away from one of my games. I want them to walk away feeling like they had fun, like they built something, that they feel clever, there was a sense of progression. And tournaments can do all those things, but I think in a tournament, winning is the most important thing, and it kind of overrides all those other aspects. And I didn't want to make winning the most important thing when someone plays one of my games. It's important, but not the top notch. So I've kind of stayed away from having tournaments since then. I encourage fans to run them if they want to run a fan tournament in their local game store, something like that. I love to see that, but it's been something I've officially stayed away from.
I mean, do you think it feels slightly sort of antithetical to the way modern hobby gamers play games? Because Magic is a lifestyle game, and I can't think of a board game that is one, right?
Definitely not on the level of Magic. There are other living card games and collectible games where companies have tried to do that, and with some levels of success. But I think it's pretty difficult. I think we're now seeing it maybe a little bit more in the video game industry, but not in the tabletop industry. Yeah.
I mean, do you ever see sort of an analog version of esports at any point in the future?
I think there was a company that tried it a few years ago. They seem to have pretty big wallets, and they sponsored a big tournament in Vegas that was of that style, really, really flashy. And I heard from a reviewer that went there, that was invited there, that they were paid to go there. Their tickets were covered, their hotel was covered, that it was fun and neat, and they kind of hoped that something like that would exist in the game world, but that it didn't. The one-to-one comparison of the lavish video game tournaments did not match up with the analog aspect of tabletop games. So perhaps someone else will try it someday, but that specific method I don't think worked all that well.
So I want to talk now about your starting in the industry. So you became very famous for being the man who not only ran successful Kickstarters, but knew how to run successful Kickstarters. What made you want to publish your own games and not pitch them to publishers in a more conventional way?
Well, the main factor, I mean, Kickstarter was a major motivator itself, in that I really didn't even think about submitting a game to a publisher at the time, because I was so in love with the idea of being able to connect one-on-one with people whose names I could see, many times their faces I could see on Kickstarter, who were passionate about the same thing that I was passionate about. That was really exciting and important to me. And so that kind of, that overrode any other options that I could have explored. That was the main motivating factor for me.
And so what was it about the platform of Kickstarter specifically? Was it some sort of, I have complete artistic autonomy?
That wasn't a big part of it. I mean, that was nice to have, that I didn't have someone looking over my shoulder, but at the same time, I realized pretty early on, and perhaps not even soon enough, that I needed to find people to look over my shoulder, and both for encouragement and for accountability. And so that's where I brought in my business partner, Alan, a friend of mine. I didn't bring him in. He was excited by the same stuff, and he joined me, and it was exciting to have him as part of that. And over the years, I've added lots of different types of people who I want them to hold me accountable. So while I like the freedom that I do run my own company, I do design many of the games that we publish, and I like the freedom of making those choices, I'm still often looking for other people to... I'm looking for their approval. I don't want to violate the trust that I've tried to earn over the years, basically.
How are you at taking notes? Are you someone who becomes bristly and uncooperative, or are you very good when people criticize your work?
It depends on what stage I'm in the process. So if I'm in the playtest stage for a game, I'm very open to criticism. That's when I want criticism. I'm looking for it. I actively ask players, like, what were you frustrated by? Like, what was confusing? What was not intuitive? I can bristle a little bit, and I've tried to just not respond because I'm human. I'm passionate about what I do, and when I do see criticism online, if it's constructive, I'm able to take it pretty well. If it's someone just wanting to hate on one of my games, even though there might be something of merit of what they're saying, I do struggle with hearing that or reading that, and so I've learned just to either not read it or not respond and walk away.
And so, yeah, as I said, you were sort of very famous in those early days for being someone who knew Kickstarter. How long did it take you to get your Kickstarter ducks in a row? And did you make any big mistakes at first that led you to write your blog and try and prevent other people from making them?
Yes, and you said that perfectly, because that was a huge motivator for why I started writing my Kickstarter blog, because I did make a lot of mistakes. Really, in every campaign, I made mistakes. There was never a perfect campaign. I don't know if there's such thing. But with Viticulture, there were some close calls and some mistakes. The original art for Viticulture that didn't even end up in the game was not reminiscent of a board game. It was a good inspiration for the final artist, Best of Bell, but I don't think it was up to par. And the project may not have succeeded to the level that it did with the original art. I offered flat worldwide shipping. So there's a U.S. shipping rate and then a worldwide shipping rate. And I kind of thought, okay, I'll just figure that out later. I should have budgeted much more closely. And it ended up being a good thing because I was able to figure out this worldwide fulfillment center thing that is used by creators. Many creators now use the system that I kind of forged the path for, where you send games from the manufacturer to different fulfillment centers around the world, and they dispatch from those regional fulfillment centers. That really wasn't a thing until I tried it for Viticulture. And there was also one thing that almost happened. We almost reached a stretch goal for metal coins, for replacing the cardboard coins in the game with metal coins. And if we had done that, we definitely would have run out of money because that it's just too expensive to upgrade cardboard to metal as a stretch goal. It should have been an add-on instead. So that was a close call that really would have been detrimental for my company. Unfortunately, we didn't reach that stretch goal, so it didn't happen.
And so you did a number of Kickstarters. You did Viticulture, then you did Euphoria, you did Viticulture again. You did Scythe, and then you decided to step back. Why did you decide to step back from Kickstarter?
Scythe was a weird experience because Scythe was, I think, on almost every level, a very successful Kickstarter. It raised $1.8 million, had a ton of backers who were really excited about it. Most of those backers were really, really happy with the final product they received. And we delivered, I think our communication was great. We delivered on time and even early to most backers. But despite all that, it took a big emotional toll on me for a variety of factors. There was the stress of a few fulfillment centers that just didn't follow through with what they were supposed to do. There was the response of some backers who were getting their games 6 weeks early, but they wanted their games 7 weeks early instead. And that really weighed on me. It was shocking to me that was a thing that was happening, given how early we were delivering the game. It's a lot of time, too, to run a Kickstarter. To plan for it, to execute it, to go through all those steps after the execution and the delivery. And I also really wanted to better engage distributors and retailers. I saw that as the long-term approach for my company to really get into worldwide distribution, and I wasn't sure the Kickstarter was helping that. So I had a chat with Alan, my business partner, and some other people, and we decided to step away. And so that was back in 2015. Our last Kickstarter was 2015. We made the decision in the summer of 2016, and we haven't used Kickstarter since.
And so what have been the advantages and disadvantages? I guess the advantage of Kickstarter is that you get your money up front. What have been the advantages of becoming a more traditional publisher? Do you think it makes people look at your company? What's the best way to say it? Do you think they take your company more seriously? That you've gone through this sort of small startup phase and now you're an established publisher who can publish things off your own back?
In some ways, yes. I'll share a little anecdote in a second, but the overarching answer is I think Kickstarter has become such a big part of the game industry that many people just even assume that if a company has a new game coming out, that it might just be on Kickstarter. So I don't think there's much bias anymore about a game being on or off Kickstarter, although I have heard some great feedback from people who are excited that when I announce a new game, like I announced Tapestry very recently, when I announce a new game, that means that we've already made it and that they're going to get a copy if they pre-order from us in just a few weeks, so they don't really have to wait that long. Opposed to that gap for Kickstarter. But the one thing that your comment really reminded me of is that I did get a little tired of hearing from reviewers that they seemed like, this was back in like 2014, 2015, it seemed really important to reviewers to mention that it was a Kickstarter game. Not that it was a game, but that it was specifically a Kickstarter game. And that meant different things to different reviewers, that maybe they focused on the bling of the game and that somehow wasn't relevant to the experience of the game. Or that because it was a Kickstarter game, there was a public perception of people who were excited about the game because it was on Kickstarter and not just because it was a game that they enjoyed. It just seemed weird that reviewers kept mentioning that it was a game that was on Kickstarter rather than talking about the experience they had of playing the game. So that wasn't a motivating factor, but I got a little tired of that.
And do you think you'll ever go back?
I don't plan to. I genuinely don't plan to, because I really like the system that we use right now. But it is possible. It's a thrill ride. It's fun. It's nice to have that money up front. It's nice to have the ability to gauge early adopter demand through a Kickstarter campaign. So I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I would say it's highly unlikely.
So your next game then is Hanamakoji. So why are you taking this one to the cabin?
This is... I have a couple different two-player games that I really enjoy, and I just wanted one... I wanted to take one, specifically a two-player game that I really loved. Hanamakoji is an I Cut You Choose game, which is one of my favorite mechanisms in games. Or that's one of the core mechanisms in it. And it's easy to teach, it's easy to play. Every time after I play, I want to play again, whether I win or lose. Have you played it? Have you played Hanamakoji?
I've never played it, no, and a lot of people say it's absolutely fantastic, and I really should get it to the table, I think.
It's a delight. I hope you get the chance to play it sometime, because it is even just a really short game, too. But yeah, I thought I wanted to have one game at the cabin to play with a variety of other people one-on-one.
And so what does this do well that other two-player games don't?
That's a good question, because there are other two-player games that I love. I love Seven Wonders Duel, Keyforge recently I've loved, Patchwork I love. But Hanamakoji is just so elegant. It is such an elegant game. It's just a few cards and a few tokens. So it really doesn't, even though the cards are beautiful, it doesn't have that table presence of many other games, as good as it looks. It doesn't have a gotta-have component in it, must-have component. But I'm happy when I play it. And it has, ever since I played it, it's perennially made my top 10 list. So it's a game that I continue to want to play with anyone and everyone.
And do you think that because there's been a big, in the sort of last 6 or 7 years, Asian design has become more and more popular amongst sort of Western gamers, do you think there's something particular to Asian design that is different to Western game design? I have seen,
that's a good question. I don't want to overgeneralize, because I'm sure there definitely are some designers in Japan and Korea and China that are designing big, complex games. But it does seem that many of the games on my shelf that are from designers from that region of the world are streamlined and elegant and really focused. And while that isn't always what I want in a game, I do really appreciate that, especially for games in small packages. Yeah.
And do you think, because often people complain about games that have a sort of take that aspect because they feel like they're getting ganged up on. Do you think part of the beauty of two-player games is that you can't feel persecuted? Because if there's attacking in the game, it's got to be you that is attacked because the person's not going to attack themselves, right? Do you think that's a good thing about two-player games, that you can sort of get your aggression out on another player?
I do. Yeah, that's a great point. Because even in a three-player game, especially in a three-player game, if you choose to attack one player and not another, it's seen as a choice, and it's seen as maybe there's something behind that. But in a two-player game, you're both opting into that experience of going at each other, or at least competing directly against one another, and that is pretty nice. Yeah, so I think that will help appeal to maybe some personality types in the cabin that may otherwise be a struggle in multiplayer games.
So I want to go on now and talk about you as a designer and what your sort of ethos is. And one thing I've noticed about your games is that it seems that you're constantly working towards the short turn. So I think about something like Scythe in comparison to something like Through the Ages, where the length of turn is completely different. Is that something that you think about a lot, that a game should clip around the table?
That is very much a part of my design philosophy. Yeah, I really like short, simple turns where you do one, maybe two things, and then the next player goes. As I've evolved as a designer and become more aware of what I like and dislike, I've really paid attention to the flow of the game and how it impacts how players are feeling. I really like the game to just flow from one turn to the next, to the next, to the next. And so part of that are the short, simple turns. Part of that is I generally don't have rounds or phases in my games. I want players to be fully immersed in the game without having the game telling them, "Hey, stop and do this thing real quick." I just want players to do their turn and then pass and let the other player take their turn. Yeah.
Is downtime anathema to you?
I do like to avoid downtime. As much as possible. There are other methods of doing that, like certain types of simultaneous play. In a drafting game, you often have that. But and part of that is because I really like our games. In fact, it's a requirement that all of our games must play at least 5 players, ideally 6. And so downtime is a major focus then during playtesting of have we gone too far if we have 6 players? Is there too much downtime? Do we need to cut it down to 5? And so even with 5, I'm constantly paying attention to that. Are there things that I can cut and streamline so that there isn't downtime when you do have that 5-player game?
And so from watching your YouTube channel, it's very clear that you're someone who likes not only to play games, design games, but think about games and talk about games. Are there any designers that have really influenced you? Who have been the biggest influences on your design? And is there one sort of central mechanic that is a well you keep going to?
I've tried to avoid falling back on one central mechanism because I want to continue to stretch myself as a designer and to offer unique and new and hopefully innovative things to people who play my games. So I think it's more my games often feel similar, but a lot of them have very different mechanisms. As for designers who have been really inspiring for me, Uwe Rosenberg definitely has been up there in terms of the style of games he makes and just the sheer variety. Like Patchwork is one of my favorite 2-player games. That's such a simple game, but then games like Agricola and Caverna, Feast for Odin are on the opposite end of the spectrum, but I love them just as much. Rob Daviau has been a huge inspiration for me, especially in terms of narrative and story in games. He's the designer of the whole legacy concept. He's started the whole legacy game concept and inspired me to make Charterstone. And then Alexander Pfister is one of the other designers that I really, really love. His favorite game of mine is Isle of Skye, or my favorite game of his is Isle of Skye. And I feel good when I play his games. I love the sense of progression and building and just the interesting mechanisms that he uses in his games have definitely inspired me.
And how was it to have Uwe Rosenberg design a set of cards for viticulture then?
It was... I'm shaking my head right now because I'm still kind of in disbelief that could happen. One of my favorite designers actually reached out to me and said, "Hey, I like your game." I don't think he initiated I think he said, I like your game, I enjoyed it. And I came back to him and said, if you ever want to design like a promo card or two, that would make my life right there for you to do that. And then he shows up 3 days later with 80 cards that he designed. He's incredible. I'm in awe of what he does, and he's, at least for my brief exchanges over message and email, he's truly just a really nice person, which is really neat to see for someone who's had so much success in the industry.
And another thing that I noticed about your games is they seem to be forgiving of mistakes. Is that also part of your design plan, that if players make the wrong decision, there's an avenue for them to come back?
Yeah, and a big part of that is related to how I want players to learn my games. I focused a lot in recent years on how easy my games are to learn, which is debatable. I know that's very subjective, but it really is my intent for someone to be able to sit down, have one person at least who knows how to play the game, and have that person explain a few core concepts, and then just have people start taking turns. And so it goes back to what you just asked. If my games had decisions that you make early in the game that are punishing or that could have huge repercussions throughout the game, that style of teaching wouldn't be possible because from the beginning your turns would be too important. So it's this tough balance of I want players to have interesting turns that matter, but I also want there to be enough flexibility in the game that early on in the game, when you don't understand the strategy and when you're learning the game for the first time, that you can still make good decisions or make decisions without knowing all the rules and not have the game be ruined for you.
I was struck. I played Kalis for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and I was struck at how much more harsh the game was in comparison to a lot of games you get today, especially worker placement games. Do you think that there is a worry that games become too easy, that there's too little of a challenge and they become too forgiving and then become pedestrian?
If there were only 10 designers making games, yes. But there are so many games and so many flavors of games and different designers and different publishers that might be a trend that happens with some games, and it might be a problem with some games. But there's just such a wide variety. Like Vital Lacerda is going to keep making games until he dies, and he's going to keep making big, complex, meaty games that have those types of decisions that he's always going to have an audience. So there's always going to be at least one of him and others like him. So I'm not concerned about that style of game going away completely.
So your next game then is a new one, and this is on tour. And so what is it about this game, because it's not been out for very long, that has grabbed you enough that you want to spend the apocalypse with it?
And this was a very specific choice for the scenario you gave to me about the cabin and the apocalypse. On Tour is a game, it's a roll and write game that scales infinitely. And I want to have a game in the cabin where no matter how many people have shown up to the cabin, we can play that game together. We can play it together. And On Tour does that, because in On Tour you are rolling 2 dice. All players are then writing down 2 numbers on their map and simultaneously, and then someone else rolls the dice. It doesn't really matter who rolls the dice. And so even if we run out of, it comes with these really nice whiteboards that you write on. Even if we run out of them, we can draw out new maps. We can create new maps of our own to share with others. And whether there are 3 people at the cabin or 200 people at the cabin, we can all play On Tour together. That was the intent behind that decision.
And do you think this game is reflective of any sort of current trend in design? I mean, roll and write clearly is very buzzy at the moment.
That would be my first answer. That roll and writes do seem very, very popular right now. I wouldn't say that roll and writes that scale infinitely have taken off as much as I thought they would, especially after the success of Welcome 2, which does scale infinitely. But hopefully we'll see a little bit more of that, because I love that idea that if I sit down at game night with On Tour with 5 people, and all of a sudden 2 more people show up. It's really easy to add them in. So I really like having a few of those games on my shelf for game night.
And so one thing I noticed when I was sort of looking at On Tour to compile this notes is how beautiful it is. The art is really quite arresting. Do you think that we've gone past the point of no return with regards to art in games now?
I think so. I don't know if it's a bad thing, but I think it does make it difficult for either people who can't. I don't want to say that they can't see what good art looks like, but I think people do have different eyes for art, and maybe they fall in love with one artist, even though most other people don't really like that style of art. But I think that the major hindrance is that it does, for new people who are trying to get into the industry, new designers, new publishers, their art budget, I think, is probably much more than it would have been if they had been trying to get into the industry 5 or 6 years ago.
And so going on from that then, I want to talk to you because you're the resident Kickstarter expert. So I want to talk to you about sort of Kickstarter in general. So how healthy do you think Kickstarter is in terms of sustainability? And what is the current state of play in Kickstarter? Are the games coming out on Kickstarter as good as the games that are going through conventional publishing channels now?
For that last question, I think fortunately, yes. I think we've seen... I think that bias of a game being a Kickstarter game and not just a game has, for the most part, as far as I could tell, has gone away. We've seen very high-quality games come out on Kickstarter. I think the one thing that I haven't necessarily seen yet is games on Kickstarter reaching the longevity that non-Kickstarter games are. And I'm not sure what the correlation is there. I'm not sure what Kickstarter has to do with that. The only thing I can think of, and I'm sure there are other reasons, maybe you have some ideas, is that with Kickstarter, people get really excited during the Kickstarter, and then they get the game, and they're excited to have it, but they don't necessarily play it because their excitement was 8 months earlier or a year earlier. And the key for any game, in my opinion, the key for any game to be an evergreen game, an evergreen success, is that it does actually get to the table quite often, so it's constantly exposed to other people.
I think that was really interesting with Scythe when it came out, because I remember, because you see your advertising campaign was genius because you started with the one image and everyone just went, ugh! And then when it came out, it was really interesting that I went to game night. I arranged at my local game club a group of people to play Scythe for the first time, and I got there and there were 5 different tables all playing Scythe that night because there was a real tangible excitement at the game having, when the game actually got into people's hands, which you're right, you don't see in Kickstarter anymore. I mean, why do you think that is? What was it about Scythe and what isn't it about these other games?
I don't know. I need to think about that, maybe write a little bit about that, because it is... the only thing that I can think of is that there are fewer games. There were fewer games then. There are more games coming out now, but on any given day, it's not like I receive multiple games from Kickstarter. Usually, maybe I receive a game every couple weeks that I backed on Kickstarter. So I'm not sure. Do you have any thoughts there? What the difference is between now and then?
I think it might just be that there's so many more games, and also it might just be that lead times are getting longer because games are getting more complex, right?
That's true. Yeah, Scythe did have a pretty... we funded in November, and I had it in people's hands as early as May, between May and July. So it wasn't that long of a gap. Even that, I think, is pretty long. And that's why I've moved to this pre-order system now that really tightens that gap to just a few weeks. And, I mean, one of the big criticisms you see people when they talk about Kickstarter is big publishing companies going on Kickstarter to fund print runs of their games. How do you feel about sort of established publishers who've had a previous life as a conventional publisher going to Kickstarter? Do you think there's a moral difficulty to that? I've never really been bothered by it. As long as they're treating their backers well, that they're communicating well. I think when you have a big publisher on Kickstarter, sometimes it can draw more people into Kickstarter for the first time. They can start to trust it more or give it a chance, and they might end up backing other projects. I don't think necessarily I think we've seen many different projects coexist at the same time on Kickstarter. Yeah, I'm for the most part fine with it. And also one thing I think a lot of people might see a bigger company on Kickstarter and say, oh, they don't need this money. They can just afford to do it. But these are private companies. No one really knows what their current cash flow situation is, and it may be much worse than they think it is because the game industry is very cyclical. I might spend $1 million in May to get some print runs started, and I won't see that money come back until October when those games arrive. So I'm okay with it. How do you feel about it?
I mean, well, the criticism is that they may distract from the smaller mom and pop people making something out of passion in their garage that wouldn't be realised without Kickstarter, and that's the original intent of Kickstarter. I mean, do you see Kickstarter now simply being a pre-order store?
I think it's gotten a lot closer to that than I thought Kickstarter even wanted it to be. I've always seen Kickstarter as they've said it's a place to bring creative projects to life, which I think is a very broad. It's casting a very broad light upon a number of different things that you could put on there. But I have been surprised by a few projects that were on there where they were already printed. And that to me is what a pre-order is. When you've already printed something and you say, okay, people, I have 10,000 copies of this thing. Who wants it? Who wants to pre-order it? And then you'll get it pretty soon after that. That to me is a pre-order. And Kickstarter has actually allowed a few projects like that. Because after that, you've already created the thing then. That's not a creative process. And
if you were to write, I mean, I guess for you it's an ongoing process, but if you were to write your Kickstarter book now, how would it be different from what you've previously written?
I actually don't know if it would be all that different. I've looked back over it over the last few years to see if I would change much about it, but I found very little. A lot of it is still relevant. And a lot of the book they're interviews and stories with creators in a variety of categories that just talks about their journeys. And those journeys today are fairly similar. The projects are a little bit more polished today, and there are a lot more of them. But I think the core concepts, the core philosophies that I discussed in the book about building an audience and putting yourself into the project, putting your passion into it, and putting the backer first, really focusing on putting the backer first as you build a community around a project, I think those still apply today. So I think the book would be fairly similar. It might just be longer.
I mean, how much do you see yourself as a personality within the industry, and how much does that connect to the success of your games? I remember I was speaking to Elizabeth about Wingspan, and I asked her if she got a lot of blowback, and she said actually much less than she'd expected, and she theorized that possibly that might be because she was under your wing and people felt less inclined to attack you. Do you see you yourself as part of your company?
Oh yeah. I think a lot of people see me as the face of Stonemaier Games, and for the most part I am. Like, I'm the one that appears, I'm the one writing the blogs and appearing on the videos and on the Facebook live chats. And I'm okay with that. I like that my company feels small and personal. I like that we're having this chat right now, and I like that I can have chats like this with people, whether it's pre-recorded or live on Facebook Live or on social media or over email. I like that. I like company. I like not that Stonemaier Games is a big company, but I always like when a big company feels small, and so I hope to keep that going even as my company grows.
So your next game then is one that you went on to sort of kind of publish yourself, and this is The Castles of Mad King Ludwig. What is it about this game that makes it so special? Is it that I split you choose mechanic?
I guess I didn't notice that there were two games that I got you choose on the list, but that's an indication of how much I love that mechanism. But that's very much what Castles of Mad King Ludwig is. It's not more I price you choose, but I love the building aspect of Castles. And it's such a rewarding game. This is something I try to do in my designs. I love to reward players constantly with multiple rewards rather than punish them. And Castles of Mad King Ludwig does that so well. Everything you do, whenever you place a tile, you almost always get some points right away. Sometimes you complete another room, and so you get a bonus from that. So you get this big sense of being rewarded throughout the game that I love. And it's just one, it's easy to teach. It's one that I've gotten at the table so many times, and I'll never turn it down. If someone wants to play it, I will always play it. And that's why I made this list.
And so this might be it's the first one I can think of, certainly within the hobby sphere, sort of mashup game. How did Between Two Cities of Mad King Ludwig come about?
Ben and Matthew, the designers of Between Two Cities, were working on a sequel to the game that was a little bit more meaty than Between Two Cities. And I suggested the theme of castles, not related to Castles of Mad King Ludwig, but just because I love castles in general. And I thought it would be a good theme. I thought people would enjoy building castles. And throughout the design process, Ben, I think in particular, found that he was looking more and more to Castles of Mad King Ludwig for inspiration, partially because he knew that I liked the game, and partially because he likes the game as well. And it got to the point where he approached me and said, "Jamey, I've got this really good game, but it really shares a lot with Castles of Mad King Ludwig." And he said, "Should I continue down this path? Should we change the theme? What should we do?" And I said, I love Ludwig so much that why don't we talk to Bezier about it and see if they want to partner up and or at least like license the IP to us in some way. And they did. And Ted was wonderful to work with. It ended up being we are the publisher of it, but Bezier is on the box. We paid them a royalty for the IP, and they were very helpful during the development process of the game and the initial marketing for the game as well.
And so do you think both games are distinct enough to stand on their own? That you can have Castles of Mad King Ludwig and Between Two Castles of Mad King Ludwig on the same game shelf, and they can fulfill two different needs? I do. Yeah, they do. They do similar things in that you are building a castle, but Castles of Mad King Ludwig is largely a game about this pricing mechanism. You're pricing the value of the tiles, and you are choosing the right time to buy them. In Between Two Castles of Mad King Ludwig, it's more of a partnership game. You're working with two people instead of just yourself. You're building two castles. You're drafting. You're not paying anything. You're just selecting tiles. There's no cost to them. And as zany as both of the castles end up, in Between Two Castles, the tiles are square, and so the zaniness has a little bit of a limit there. Whereas in Castles of Mad King Ludwig, the tiles are all different shapes and sizes, and so they end up forming very odd castles as you build them. So yeah, I do think they both stand by themselves. Have you played either or both of them? I have played Castles of Mad King Ludwig and Between Two Cities. I'm actually in the rule book for Between Two Cities because I play tested it in Essen. Oh, great. But I haven't played Between Two Castles of Mad King Ludwig. How different is it from Between Two Cities? It's the core mechanism of having two partners and two things that you're building is very similar. As well as the drafting mechanism. But in Between Two Cities, there are just, I believe, 6 tile types, maybe 6 or 7, and every tile of that type, with the exception of one category, are exactly the same. Every house tile is going to look a little different, but the mechanism is exactly the same, which makes it really easy to teach and play. But in castles, every tile, we intentionally made every castle different. So the mechanisms for all of the utility rooms are the same in castles, but each one has a slightly different combination of icons, or it might look for different things nearby. So it's just it's a little more complex, a little more complicated, a little bit more meaty. So I want to talk to you now about the future of you as a designer and Stonemaier Games in general. So you've mentioned Tapestry. Mm-hmm. So what is Tapestry? Tapestry is my attempt at a civilization game. I really wanted to design a civilization game that spanned the beginning of mankind into the future without actually being tied into real world history or events or people. So I wanted to give people the opportunity to form their own history, to tell their own story of their own civilization without feeling like they were simulating actual history. It is based in the real world. It's not not the real world. It's based in real world concepts. So it's not basically it's not like a fantasy game. So it will feel familiar. But I was really excited by this genre and wanted to give it a shot. And how will it differentiate itself from other Civ games?
Well, there is that element of a lot of different Civ games are tied to real world history, so that's very different in this game. The other aspect is, as I was looking at a lot of Civ games, many of them are they're more. And this isn't a judgment call on the quality of the games, but I found that they ended up feeling a little bit more like empire building games. Like they were a little flat. Like they might take place in the same era of history rather than really feeling like you had advanced over thousands of years of mankind. And in one of the easy identifiers for that I saw was that there are some Civilization games that are dudes on a map games, where they have people that you're moving around on a little map. And that to me is something that's taking place over the span of a few years, not 1,000 years. And so that isn't a judgment on the quality of those games, but I really thought, okay, there's a gap here. There's something that can be done differently to really make you feel like you are advancing across giant spans of history. And that's what I wanted to cover in my game.
And so what else is coming from Stonemaier? And do you think there's a limit on how big Stonemaier can be? Or do you want to impose a limit on how big Stonemaier can be?
We have kind of, we have found that publishing around 2 new games a year is the sweet spot for us, and then a few expansions or accessories in there as well. So in terms of number of new releases a year, we have no intention of growing. We kind of like being able to stay focused and small in that way. But at the same time, I hope to continue to reprint and support older games, which I think will inherently lead to other types of growth. So right now in the immediate future, we have a Wingspan expansion that's coming up. We have a My Little Scythe expansion next year. And then we have 2 games that we're working on for next year that I'm really excited about. And then I'm working on
no exclusives for me then.
Those games are so distant that no, I wouldn't reveal those. But I haven't really talked much about the My Little Scythe expansion, so you're getting a little bit of a taste there. I'm not going to say much about it, but there is a My Little Scythe expansion, and I think that will be the next one to follow the Wingspan expansion. And then I am working on a game that I've been pretty public about. I haven't said really what it is, but I've said that I am working on an open world cooperative game that's inspired by Zelda Breath of the Wild. Not the Zelda theme, but the openness and the elements of discovery found in Breath of the Wild. So that's been something I've been working on for quite some time, and will still be working on for quite some time because it's a pretty big world that I'm building. But I'm looking forward to putting that out in the world, hopefully in 2021.
And so how did it feel to win the Kennerspiel des Jahres? Is it as big a deal for you as a publisher as it would have been for you as a designer, do you think?
So I am not one to really get excited about awards. It's not my motivation for making games. I just want to make games so that people have joy at their table with their friends and family, or by themselves if they're playing solo. So the Kennerspiel caught me off guard in how good it felt. It felt validating. It felt rewarding for me. It felt... I was really excited for Elizabeth to have her first published game get that level of praise and attention, and so I was genuinely very emotional, which I was not expecting from getting a game award, and I still am thinking about it now. I can't help but feel very deeply honored and happy that we would get that award. Yeah.
So your last game then is Tzolk'in, and is this still your favourite game?
Tzolk'in has moved around on my top 10 list over the years, but it is continually, it's kind of fought with Terra Mystica as my heavy game of choice. And right now I would give that edge to Tzolk'in. I love the gears in it. I love time as a resource in games in general, and I think it's done spectacularly well in Tzolk'in. And if I ever want a heavy, meaty 2.5-hour game, and I have people who especially already know how to play it, that is my go-to game.
And so, what was really clear about Tzolk'in when it first came out was how audacious it was in terms of its production. And this is what a lot of people say about Stonemaier Games. Did this game inspire you to think, wow, I want a game that looks as resting on the table as Tzolk'in does?
I think the main the main inspiration there was that they put a new component in a game that I'd never seen before, and that new component not only looked cool, but it was also really functional and important for the mechanisms. And that idea of a must-have component, a must-have unique, innovative component, really captured me and made me want to explore components as a really important part of game design for my future designs.
And what game of yours exemplifies that the most, do you think?
Let's see, what game of mine does exemplify that the most? In terms of games, in terms of components that are functionally important but also beautiful and unique. I don't know if I really have ever pulled it off to that level that Sulkin did. Because I think we have some pretty attractive components in our games. Okay, actually, no, I do have one. The dual-layered mats and scythe, I think, meet that requirement. Because they look cool. We weren't the first company to do it, but we were one of the first to do that truly dual-layered aspect. And it's pretty important to the game, because if you... Not that people hit the table all that often, but your player mat in particular is so close to you that if your finger just hits it a little bit and those tokens go scattering across the board or across the mat, it can really wreak havoc on your experience of the game. And so I thought it was crucially important to have those dual-layered mats. And I think they add a little sense of a premium feel to a game that you're buying off a retail game store shelf.
So I got one more question then. So you're heading out to the cabin, you're fleeing the apocalypse, you're driving down the road 88 miles an hour, and you go around a corner, the back door flies open because you haven't shut it properly. 4 of the games fly out of the car, down a ravine, into a river, and are swept away to posterity. Which game do you hope is sitting on the backseat of the car?
This is such a difficult question. You've already had me narrow it down to 5, but I'm going to go with Castles of Mad King Ludwig, just because it is the one that I am the happiest, I think, to return to the most out of all of these. If you sat me down right now and said, Jamey, would you play... Jamey, you have an hour and a half. Would you play Sulkin, Ludwig, or Magic on Tour, or Hanamakoji? I would go with Ludwig.
So, if people want to get hold of you, how would they go about doing that?
The easiest place, the hub for everything, is StonemeierGames.com. It has links to my Instagram, my YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, all the other social media, all the other places that you can find me. Everything is at StonemeierGames.com.
Great. Well, Jamey Stegmaier, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
And if you want to suggest a guest, or you want to say something nice about the show, or you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on @5gamesfordoomsday on Twitter, or you can send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. You can give a rolling donation to help support the show at patreon.com/5G4D, or a one-time PayPal donation at the bottom of the website 5gamesfordoomsday.com. And if I haven't had to skip to my loo to avoid murder at the hands of the ambulatory Arctic rolls and the infectious steel-eye spans, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.